All right, so um, just a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in the Midwest in Champaign, Illinois. So my father, as I mentioned, was a professor at U of I, and my mother um, was a social worker there, and then also went and got her master's degree in library and information science. Um, I went to school first at Cornell. I was going to be a meteorology major, but that didn't quite work out. I was telling Mike before you guys joined, my parents divorced and I ran out of money and I couldn't really stay at Cornell. So I went to IU where my dad had just gotten a job. And so I was basically able to just go there for free. And they didn't have a meteorology program. So I picked another one of my interests, which was political science, and went on from there. And then once I graduated school, I went to a consulting firm called Accenture. At the time, it was called Anderson Consulting, but Accenture. And I was there for 10 years. And then in 2006, a friend of mine at work and I got seed funding from a venture capital firm called Y Combinator out in California to start a company called Inkling Markets, which at the time built these things called prediction markets. And I'll get into what that means and a lot later, but suffice to say, it was sort of the start of like what I'm doing now. So we started that in 2006 when Y Combinator had first gotten started. And then in 2011, we took a little break and went back to Y Combinator and started a second company and built what really was this like very addictive auction mechanism called a penny auction. And you may have seen the commercials for those a few years ago. And we were really into this auction mechanism and we realized how addictive and kind of evil it was and just felt like, man, this is not who we are, what we want to do. We were just sort of playing around and then we were watching people lose a lot of money playing on our system and we shut it down very quickly. So then myself and my original co-founder parted ways soon after that. He went to work for the Obama campaign, but then I continued to run Inkling, and then in 2016 started a new company called Cultivate Labs, which I'm running today, and I'll tell you more about, and found a new co-founder, and so we've continued. But the journey of working on collective intelligence and crowdsourcing and crowdsource forecasting really began for me all the way back in 2006 when I first started my first company, Inkling Markets. So the problem we're trying to solve at Inkling is that large organizations really have a lack of ground truth. And I'll tell you a little anecdote. I experienced this in my consulting days, and it's really why I started the company. And I'm sure you all can appreciate this too, that when you're on a project or you work in a lab or you're part of any like decent sized organization, there's things that you just don't say. And there's things that you might be working on a project and you know are messed up or they're ahead of schedule. But you typically only are conveying like the best news possible. You're putting a shine on the information to make it seem as good as possible. And the people who are sitting in a decision-making position then are hearing that version of the story. And it's not to say that the employees are trying to be nefarious in any way. It's just sort of like the politics of how things work. And I really experienced this a lot at the consulting firm I worked at because we were doing very large projects. They're very expensive. These are 200-300 people projects. And we would be working on these really large efforts right alongside our clients. And we would know that things were messed up. But then in the afternoon, we would go sit in a status meeting, say, and we would say, yep, everything's good. You know, status is green, the Harvey ball's full. And so they were never getting the complete picture. Yet we would talk about this stuff all the time at lunch. And then I stayed at Accenture long enough where I was on the other side of that equation as a senior manager working on pretty large projects and getting to be sort of screwed by the exact same thing where I was really trying to understand like what is going on And you could just never get there because people were worried about their jobs. They were worried about their reputation. They were worried about getting in trouble. They were worried about making people look bad. And so this lack of ground truth, really negatively impacted our projects. And when I looked into it, just really seemed like something that was impacting everyone in a pretty negative way, and sort of cataloged that at the bottom of this slide, right? It really means you miss deadlines, you miss the budget, right? Things ultimately fail when they're launched because no one could really say like this thing's going to be a dud, but then it's launched and lo and behold, it's a dud, right? So this was sort of the core problem that we've always been trying to solve. So the way we tried and tackle that was using collective intelligence in an organization. And we felt like if we could give people enough cover to really express what they think, but not get in trouble for it, then we would be doing a good thing and we would be revealing that ground truth. And so all the way back in 2006, we set ourselves up to try and capture that ground truth in a couple different ways. So the first way that we've been working on since the beginning is in the realm of forecasting. So we felt like, okay, what would be useful for people to be able to do? A lot of these problems were in forecast. Every decision has forecasts behind it, right? There's a prediction about the future whenever you're making a decision, especially in business, about moving forward with something. And so we wanted to capture people's forecasts in a way that was truthful and potentially more accurate than what we were getting from any one individual. Because I'm sure you guys have all read like Kahneman and people like that who talk about bias and cognitive biases, and I'm sure you're all quite familiar with those. And so it turns out that the kind of the smarter you are, the more expertise you have, the worse you actually may be at forecasting, because you tend to hold these very strong biases. And so your ability to forecast tends to be pretty poor. And so what we set out to do was to create a platform that would capture those forecasts from people and measure them and give them feedback about how they were doing. But we were also sort of tapping the collective wisdom of the organization to try and get at that ground truth. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. We have another product called Ignite, which is built to be like an internal Kickstarter, which is pretty cool in its own right. But I'm going to focus on the forecasting stuff for today. This is the only time I'll really talk about clients and stuff, but you can kind of see the breadth of organizations that are trying this out. There's large manufacturers, pharmaceutical companies, energy companies, advanced research labs in the government, intelligence agencies at different governments. So there's lots of different organizations that are doing this right now or have tried this. And you'll notice all of these are pretty large organizations, and that's almost exclusively who we end up working with, because that's when you sort of have these problems, is when you get to a certain size. You really want to be able to, you really gain an understanding that I'm actually not hearing what I potentially could hear from people. And so you want to be able to remedy that. So just to go back to something very basic and just talk for a second about what is crowdsource forecasting. Really all we're talking about is aggregating people's forecasts into a crowd forecast or a consensus forecast. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the jelly bean jar thing, where you put a jar of jelly beans in front of a room with 100 people and you say, how many beans are in the jar? And any individual is probably going to guess wrong. But if we took the average of everyone's guesses, it's probably going to be much closer. That's how I always describe crowdsource forecasting. That's really all we're doing, is we're taking advantage of that wisdom of the crowd. We're asking a diverse population what they think is going to happen, and then we're aggregating that and creating a consensus forecast about what we think is going to happen. And by the way, I should say, if you have questions along the way, please feel free to interrupt me. my dad was the professorial lecturer. I am not. So if I don't mind being interrupted, and if you have questions, just please let me know. So this is like, no kidding, how crowdsource forecasting actually works in an organization. So let's say there's someone who has to make a strategic or operational decision, right? And so what we'll do is we'll go work with them and actually break that down into influential events and signposts that are going to help them better understand what's going to be happening in the future in relation to that decision. So for example, a company might be deciding, should we move into a new market and start to sell our products there that we've never been in before? And so some of those influential events might be like, well, what's the regulatory environment like there? What are our competitors doing there? Do we have competitors there, or is it just a open space? Will a competitor start to sell something there in the near future? What will be the uptake that we might see if we launch something there, right? So those are the kinds of questions that we're trying to think through, so that you can imagine someone sitting there trying to make this decision, like, oh God, should we go and sell in this country? And they have this view now of like, well, my employees think there's a 80% chance that there's going to be a regulatory action that would negatively impact our ability to sell there. And they also think that there's a 72% chance that our largest competitor is going to move into the space as well, right? So that might influence your decision one way or another. The way we set this up is we pose those questions like, will there be a regulatory action in this country by the end of 2021? And we have people make forecasts on that, but it's not like a survey where we just ask them to go in once and then they're done. We actually ask them to go in regularly over time and update their forecasts. So the advantage of that is those never really get stale, and people are constantly taking in new information and they're updating their forecasts, and therefore we're able to update that consensus forecast. And so while people are doing that, the decision makers constantly being able to monitor, okay, what are those consensus forecasts? What are people thinking? What's the trend? Is it going down? Is it going up? Why? Right? So they get at that. And then by simply having people give us these forecasts, then we can create a bunch of outputs. We can get their individual forecasts. We can take the consensus forecast. We can look at trends. We can ask them for rationales of their forecasts, and do lots of neat things with those rationales to understand context of like why a trend might be moving in one way or another. And then of course we get to measure accuracy, bias, calibration, other things that I'll get into a little later. And then ultimately, right, all of that is fed back to both the decision maker, but then the individual forecaster also gets that feedback, because at a certain point, we know, like, did that country take a regulatory action? Did that competitor move into that country? And we're able to resolve and judge what happened. And so then I, as a forecaster, get feedback to say, well, when I said, I continuously was saying like 10% chance, 10% chance, 5% chance, 15% chance, based on a certain perspective that I had and certain sources that I had. But then it turned out like, darn, it actually happened. And so, where was I wrong? What did I miss? And through that process, the ideal situation is we're actually making people better forecasters over time through this ability to practice. This is what it looks like in practice. This is from one of our sites that we have out publicly. So we have very few sites that are public. Mostly we're doing this internally with employees, but this is one where we have running externally with a think tank at Georgetown. And so they've asked about the combined revenue of the FANG, right, group plus Microsoft. And so they're giving these different ranges, and people can just put in a probability distribution for these different ranges. They put in a rationale and they go ahead and submit that forecast. And then you can see, like, over time, since they asked this question, this is what the consensus trend has been doing. So this blue line of more than 680 billion initially, like this was where the consensus was, but clearly you can see it's continued to go down. And this is obviously based on some information that people are continuing to take in. And so this other number is this other range is starting to move up and is now, a couple of weeks ago eclipsed where this one was, and this one's just continued to go down. So you get to sort of look at this trend, and then of course you can go back and look at the data and say, well, what are the rationales that people are putting in? Like, what did they first say here to justify a 70% plus consensus value, and like, why is this starting to go down, right? And you can do that kind of analysis. And so for the decision maker, I mean, that's invaluable, right? If you think about it, the way decisions are typically made in these organizations, they are doing it themselves, or they have a small group of people that they confer with, or they're only using, data modeling, if that's even possible. But they're not necessarily able to sort of tap a large number of people who you could argue are the most informed people about a lot of these issues. But this is the kind of thing that they now are able to do. And this is kind of what we share with our clients. And this is we can do all sorts of visualizations, and we can do all sorts of analysis on the data that we're collecting. So in this example, this is just a simple plot where we've shown the orange dots are someone's original forecast, and the blue lines are that same person making updates. So whoever made updates, the blue line shows like where they made the update. And so you can see over time, like in this example, at the beginning of April, people were sort of in the higher bounds, at least between 0 and 40% probability. And then over time, probably as it became less and less likely that this event was going to happen, people were updating their forecasts. And you can see the sort of general trend of the downward lines, right? As people were saying, okay, we're getting close to the date of this question, and so this really isn't going to happen. And then you can also sort of line this up with not only the rationales I talked about, but just news and other events that are there. And you can see like, okay, something happened on a particular date. Did it move anyone? And indeed, like in this example, some news came out, and you can see a handful of lines that actually sort of break the trend and actually go up. So you can look for the trend, but you can also look for anyone expressing sort of a counter trend and going against that, and really dig into that and say, okay, why are the vast majority of people going in one direction, but a few people are going in the other? And what are their rationales? And should I, as a decision maker, really care about that? One of the things we've been working on a lot recently is being able to do cohort analysis of our forecasters. So this turns out to be really interesting because we can really slice and dice our forecaster pool any way we want. And we're able to say that people in a certain geography have these judgments, but people in another geography have these different judgments, or the people in this geography are showing these types of biases, and people here are showing a different type of bias. And we can sort of just slice and dice that however we want, which is just super interesting when you're trying to think about like my employees and what their beliefs are and what their perspectives are. Being able to really dig down in that, we've seen a lot of organizations really use that as a way to go back to the organization to be able to sort of course correct that. We did a project a while ago with Procter & Gamble where they were able to measure that their executive cohort, I'll call them, was always over optimistic about milestones that they were asking about for their projects. But the people that were below the executive level tended to actually be too pessimistic, like they were just too negative about everything. But they were able to actually measure this and then give everyone that kind of feedback, like, hey, you tend to really sort of drink the Kool-Aid when it comes to thinking about delivering on milestones. And so you really need to tamp that back. And then they could go to the employees and say, like, look, you don't have to be so negative. Like, we actually do better than you think. So when you're thinking about your ability to hit deadlines and things, like, you don't have to be so negative, because it doesn't actually reflect reality. Just quickly, this people ask me a lot, like, okay, well, Adam, did you come up with this? And it's like, no, absolutely not. This has there's a very, very long history of this concept. I mean, I even mentioned, in the 4th century, Aristotle wrote about wisdom of the crowd in his book Politics. But I think the real start to this was in 1906 when there was a British statistician named Francis Galton, and he was at a fair, and he wanted to run an experiment, kind of like the jelly bean experiment, where he put an ox up on a stage, and he said, all right, let's everyone guess the weight of this ox. And he saw that the veterinarians and the farmers and like all these people were way off, but the townspeople, in combination with those folks, the mean or the median was like within 1% of the right answer. And so in essence, he had just discovered mean and median. But that's sort of like a very generalized wisdom of the crowd principle. And then in 1988, the University of Iowa launched Iowa Electronic Markets, which was actually a real betting market to be able to make bets on who you thought was going to win presidential elections. And so same concept that we've been talking about, aggregating opinions, but it was what's called a prediction market, which I mentioned earlier, which is same concept, but I'm actually sort of putting money where my mouth is, and I can make bets on what I think is going to happen. So I can say, well, I think there's an 80% chance candidate A is going to win, and I'm actually going to spend some money to express that belief. And what's interesting about that is I get to see, well, how strongly do you feel about your forecast based on the amount of money that you may wager or trade in that prediction market. Then in 2004, there's a great book by James Surowiecki called Wisdom of Crowds, where he brings light to a lot of the Galton and the Iowa electronic markets and other things. And this is really when I think the concept started to hit the business crowd. Surowiecki was a reporter for the New Yorker, I think at the time. And so he writes this book and it turned into a bestseller. And that's when people really started to get this concept of like wisdom of the crowds. And you can actually, around that time is really when you also start to see people taking advantage of this in domains completely outside of forecasting. So you think about like all of your crowdsource like rating systems on Uber and Yelp and places like that. That's really when all of that really started to take hold. And now we take all of that for granted, but there's so much kind of wisdom of crowd stuff built into the applications and experiences that we use now. And then in 2011 to 2015, the US intelligence community spent about, it was like 35 or 40 million dollars, I think, to do a pretty large research project on crowd forecasting. And their goal was to see if people in the general population could take open source information. They didn't have access to anything classified like the folks at the CIA do. And could they make accurate forecasts about geopolitical events? And it turned out that they could. And they discovered that indeed, like people with access just to open source information were really good at forecasting. And there's actually a book that Phil Tetlock wrote. He's a professor at Penn, I think at Wharton specifically, and it's called Super Forecasters. And he found that not only could you take people from the general population, have them predict events pretty accurately about geopolitics, but under certain conditions, you could actually create a class of what he called super forecasters. So you could train people in debiasing and other methods that would make them more rational in their consideration of forecasting. You could put them on teams and have them actually collaborate and work together on forecasting problems. So and then he did a bunch of math related like aggregation mechanisms. So decaying people's forecasts over time because they sort of become outdated, only taking a certain percent, using only a certain percentage of forecasts in your aggregation calculation, looking at people's past performance and weighting them accordingly. So like if I'm really good at forecasting in a certain topic, then you might weight me heavier in the aggregation than you would someone who's new or someone who's performed poorly. So that team, it was called Good Judgment, did a lot of that work. And so that has sort of kicked off the next, I'd say, 5 or 6 years of work from 2016, of people really trying to use those kinds of techniques and really just improve upon what we had been working on for the 10 years before that, of just getting people to make their forecasts. And now it's just a much, I think, richer experience, and we're able to just do a lot more based on a lot of the research that these guys did. And this is just more about the government program, which I just touched on, so we can skip this. A lot of times there's a question about kind of where's the sweet spot. So when I meet with more data-driven folks, they'll say, well, why can't you just model this? Why do you need humans in the loop anymore? And so I wanted to make this slide to specifically address that, because I don't want to suggest that this is better than models, or there's some, I'm not religious about this at all. Models and machine learning have their place, and certainly they're really good at certain classes of forecasting problems. But there are still, at least for now, classes of forecasting problems which are really hard to model, and that humans are still best suited to respond to. So take the geopolitical problems that we were talking about and think about how many, this list here in the bottom left, like how many moving parts are there when you're trying to predict an election or some country attacking another country, right? There's not a lot of historical perspective typically, and there's not like these nice clean data sets to react to for a model to learn from. And so you really still need human intuition to try and think about all of the different variables that are at play, weigh those, and turn those into some sort of a forecast. Look, in eventually in 20 years, then that might not be the case. But for now, us humans, we still, I think, have a role to play for certain types of forecasts. And now, just to get a little more detailed, these are some examples of the types of forecasts that organizations are making. So resource allocation decisions, right? So imagine a company with a pharmaceutical company with a portfolio of projects, and they're trying to decide, okay, what drug compound should we move forward, and what should we hold back? And so they might be asking about certain milestones that compound can meet. And you might say, well, just let the science dictate that. But if you can ask people to predict what the science is going to do, say 6 months ahead of time, and everyone is saying that, hey, the science is there, like this is going to work, then that might cause you to say double down on that particular project and get it out the door quicker. And when you do that in a large pharmaceutical company, if that means even getting the drug out a few months earlier, if it actually then makes it all the way through trials and into the market, you're literally talking about millions or hundreds of millions of dollars in additional revenue earlier, by sort of having that early signal that, hey, this is going to be a big deal. Or on the flip side, if everyone thinks like this is just a dud, it at least makes you second guess why you are putting so much money into something. And you might call the program manager and say, like, the entire department thinks that this isn't going so well. Like, why? We're not going to cancel it, but like, why is that, right? It's this transparency that didn't exist before, where you now have this pretty credible signal saying like something's not working. So why isn't it? Then there's examples like guiding demand planning. So a lot of people use this to predict sales. They use it to predict competitor sales, pricing, supply chain type questions. Will suppliers get us the widgets in time for us to produce this? Will we have quality control issues? That type of thing. Then there's things like strategic planning. So higher level stuff like growth, some core technology that our business is really dependent on. Is it going to be able to reach a certain milestone? Will AI be able to do X by Y date? so that we can sort of plan for that in our product roadmap. And then things like policy changes. So this is a more sort of a government focus, but thinking about informing policy making. And okay, I'm going to make a policy about generalizable AI and limitations on that. And so what are the questions that I want to ask that inform maybe when certain milestones are going to be met, or the capabilities that that some technology will have by a period of time, or my competitors getting hold of that technology and doing something nefarious with it, asking about those kinds of things to inform the policies that a government or a large organization might make. And then finally, in terms of the benefits that organizations get from doing this, I think it's pretty clear, like, okay, we might get some more accurate forecasts, but the one thing that I always like to bring up, because I don't think it's talked about enough, is it is a catalyst for some cultural changes in these organizations. So because you are asking people to do this, because they're often have cover, I'll call it a safe space, if you will, to be able to express what they actually think, that feels empowering to them. And they feel like they have a seat at the table where decisions are being made. And people don't typically feel like that when they're sitting in a large organization. They feel like, okay, they're paying me to do X. I wear this hat, I do my thing, and then I go home and I come back the next day and I do it again. They don't have me thinking about sort of larger strategic questions. But really, I, as just your everyday employee, I have a perspective on those things. I live and breathe a company and its products and its competitors and its customer service issues and everything else every single day. And so I'm actually an excellent person to ask a lot of these questions to. And so by asking, then I feel quite empowered to feel like, all right, I am making an impact beyond just like what they pay me to do every day. So there's a real culture change that starts to happen when we have a successful program, when we create this life cycle of decision makers asking questions and the rest of the organization responding, and then decision makers responding to that and acknowledging those inputs, acknowledging the consensus forecast, or acknowledging individual forecasters to say, I see you, I hear you. We might not change course, but here's why we're not going to change course. Or maybe they say, we are going to change course based on this input. But that life cycle of asking, input, acknowledgement, right? That really is sort of radical in terms of how things work today. Every organization likes to talk that they have information flow like that, but they don't. They really, really don't. And so if you can generate that, it can be quite a change agent in these organizations. So I'll stop there.